Do you remember being a little kid and kind of how you reacted to seeing a scary movie or reading a horror book or getting freaked out by ghost stories that your friends told you at a sleepover or a slumber party, whatever you want to call it? Do you remember? It was so scary that you had to sleep with the lights on because you knew that as soon as those lights go off, the shadows in the corners of the room start to make faces at you. And the longer that you looked at that face, the clearer the face became until you thought that, is that thing going to speak to me in a minute? I really miss that kind of fear, you know? That's one of the downsides of growing up, is that you get a little bit jaded, you get a little bit desensitized, you've seen it all before, you know? Now, I read a lot of horror books, and so this Halloween, I wanted to share with you what I consider to be the 10 scariest books that I've ever read. And I'm going to get started with the infamous House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. So House of Leaves is probably the most unique book I've ever read. On the surface, it's about this family who moves into a new house and they quickly realize, sorry, my desk is such a mess at the moment. They quickly realize that, you know, something's off, something isn't right about this place. And after taking a couple of measurements, the father of the household kind of discovers that the place is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, but only by a little bit. Just enough to make you go, hang on a minute, am I crazy here? Like, what? Let me measure that again. Let me measure that again. And he starts to become a little bit obsessed with this, you know, getting different technologies, laser measurements and bringing in experts and all that kind of thing. And as he slowly starts to explore this house and goes deeper into the measurements and why things are the way they are, he makes some disturbing discoveries about the home. I'm not going to give any spoilers about any of these books, obviously, right? I want you to be able to enjoy them. But the thing I think that makes this book so different is that it's actually a story within a story within a story. So that's what the story's about on the surface, but then you've got this other guy called Johnny Truant, and he finds a manuscript all about this family and the strange things that went on in the house. And as he reads through it, Johnny starts to see kind of like weird parallels between this family and what they're going through and his own life. And he feels like he's falling into this nightmare. This book definitely isn't going to be for everyone. I would say rather than just reading a book, I think it's better to think of this as an experience. I actually took a few days off of work so that I could sit down and really dig my teeth into this. It's really trippy, and I think what this book is most famous for is its use of typography and page layouts. Let me show you some examples of what I'm talking about. So yeah, like here's a good example. So you can see here, look, you've just got the bottom text here, and this happens quite frequently, you know. But then let me try and find some more kind of like crazy examples. So look here. Now we see things are really ramping up. You know, you've got certain text in blue boxes. You've got lists of architects down the side here. Some of the parts are written sideways, so you have to kind of turn the book. You really are taking an active role in reading this book. And as I was reading it, you know, I was flipping back and forth through the pages and the appendices and everything. I felt as though as I was reading it, I was losing my mind. And that's the fun of it, you know? That's the whole idea of this book, is you're trying to piece together what exactly is happening here. And because it's layered in that way, where it's a story within a story within a story, you feel as the reader as though you are that additional layer. You know, you're the next layer in the story, you know, and what comes beyond that. It's really immersive in that way. Like I say, it's not going to be for everyone. Some people are really going to look at this and go, what is this, you know? But for people who like those unique and immersive experiences when it comes to fiction, something like just totally different to anything else that you might have read in the past, then I would recommend House of Leaves. Next up is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. So I decided when I was making this list that I was only going to include one Stephen King book, because otherwise it might start to become a little bit of a semi-Stephen King list, and I wanted to avoid that. I think that Pet Sematary, in my opinion, is Stephen King's scariest book. It's about Dr. Lewis Creed, who moves his family into a small town in Maine and discovers this old burial ground in the woods behind their new house. All of the locals know that this is a place where their pets can be buried and then brought back to life. But when they come back, they're different. You know, it's almost as if they're not really alive. It's a bit of a half-life that they're experiencing. They're able to kind of interact with things, but, you know, they're changed. I'm not going to tell you too much about this book because, again, I want to avoid spoilers. It doesn't just go for shock, though. That's what I like about this book. It dives into the kind of themes of grief and how far people might go when they're pushed to the edge by the loss of the little ones that they love. And there's just this great small town American feel to it that Stephen King just does so well. I don't think there's anyone else that does small town America as well as Stephen King. And there's this unsettling vibe as well that just builds and builds. And sometimes I can be a little bit critical of Stephen King's endings. I think that's a pretty common complaint for a lot of Stephen King fans, is that they think he's amazing at building it up, but sometimes, you know, knocking it down, he falls short sometimes. But in my opinion, this is one of Stephen King's better endings as well. So you can kind of rest assured with that. Another book that really freaked me out was The Troop by Nick Cutter. So this was a rough read. The Troop is about a group of boys who go on this camping trip with their scoutmaster to this isolated island in Canada. And you know, they're ready for adventure. They're a bunch of young boys away from their family and they're all excited, you know, but things take this horrible turn when this stranger carrying this parasite shows up. And now the boys are stranded and alone as this infection starts to spread amongst the scout group. This book is, I would say, mostly known for its intense body horror and scenes that really stick with you, that kind of bring that raw, almost too graphic scenes, you know? I'm not someone who really likes that kind of thing. Like, I don't love blood and guts and gore and all that kind of stuff, whether it's like books or movies. You know, I don't like the Saw movies and all that. It's just, I prefer things that are scary as opposed to gross, if you know what I mean. That's more my taste. But with this, I just felt like it was really fitting because the fear that it's playing with is a kind of fear of like transformation and becoming something that you don't want to become, and that sort of like anxiety. I think it also captures unique fears amongst like adolescent boys, especially in a setting that's all about survival. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know how young boys are. Oh, who's the alpha male in the group? Am I going to be able to defend myself if things get violent? Am I going to be a coward? Would my dad be proud of how I'm acting at the moment? You know, all those kind of anxieties that young boys have about not being sufficient enough. Not being physically capable enough. That kind of fear is just like always there. It's always present. A lot of people would, I think, compare this book to Lord of the Flies. The way that I compared it is, it's like Lord of the Flies on acid. You know, it's just much darker and more visceral and way more gory as well. For fans of Carrie, I think they're going to see some similarities as well. You know where Carrie uses that epistolary style of storytelling where it has news articles and other documents mixed in. That kind of adds another layer of depth and realism to the story. You're going to see that in this as well. You know, just every so often interspersed between chapters, there are news articles and police interviews and things like that. But just one other thing as well, and it's important that I tell you this: there is animal violence in this book. There's a few occasions where there is animal violence, which, you know, you expect human violence, but you might not necessarily expect the animal violence. For me as well, that was those scenes were the hardest parts to read. You kind of felt like, oh man, you know, need a little breather, you know, after those scenes. They were really rough, you know, because animals are so innocent, aren't they, you know? But yeah, anyway, just a heads up if that's like a real red line for you. The next book, which I just found to be so creepy, is The WASP Factory by Ian Banks. The WASP Factory is about Frank. He's this 16-year-old lad who lives with his unusual father on a remote Scottish island. Recently, Frank's older brother I don't know why I'm smiling. Frank's older brother has been confined to a psychiatric hospital. I know why I'm smiling, because I'm remembering some of the scenes which come later on. And Frank and his dad have been told that he has escaped and he's now on his way home on foot. Basically, he's traveling through Scotland, or they don't actually say if he's in a hospital in Scotland or maybe Britain, but he's on his way home, basically. And throughout the novel, the presence of Frank's older brother just looms, and he makes these disturbing phone calls to Frank. And for me, these phone calls are like the highlight of the book. They're really creepy, but they're also funny in a twisted kind of a way. And I think that is intended by the author, that they're supposed to be a little bit funny just with the absurdity of these phone calls that he's making. Now, you might think to yourself, hearing this synopsis, that Frank is maybe the victim in all of this, but actually, Frank Frank is crazier than all of them. He is a literal serial killer, and he has been since he was a very little boy. He takes people out in really creative ways and for strange reasons. I think the reason that I found this book to be so creepy, other than like the setting of this sort of desolate little island, this small Scottish town at the edge of the sea, other than that, it's also just being inside Frank's head and hearing the way that he kind of reasons things out. You know, he's the way he tries to justify himself to the reader, because everything's told in a first person perspective. And hearing his justifications is almost as horrifying as the actions that he's performing. It's kind of like The Troop in a way, where there's parts of it that you just feel like you need to put it down, take a breather, have a nice cup of tea, you know? Next up, another British author, the Hellbound Heart. My accent slipped out a little bit there. My little Cockney accent coming out. Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. And I have to change the way I speak sometimes so that everyone can understand me. You know, the Americans, they might not be able to understand everything I say if I speak in a hard accent. So this is the novel that inspired Hellraiser, and I've actually never seen the film. So I went into this kind of blind. The Hellbound Heart opens with another character called Frank, and he's this guy who, you know, he's just kind of obsessed with exploring the limits of physical pleasure. He's got this like insatiable thirst for this kind of hedonism that he just can't seem to satisfy in this world that we occupy. And so he seeks out otherworldly pleasures. And that's where the story begins. He makes contact with these demons called the Cenobites. They kind of give him access to heightened sensations, but not just of pleasure, but also of pain as well. It's like they can't really differentiate between pain and pleasure. They just see physical sensations as one thing. So now it kind of makes him shudder just to touch his own skin, and just to blink is like agonizing. They've just turned everything up to 11, and he's locked in this living hell. He's trapped in this other realm with the Cenobites. And like I say, all of this happens inside the first few pages. This is like the opening scene of the book. And so there won't be any spoilers beyond that. But yeah, and then the rest of the book follows Julia, who is Frank's sister-in-law. They were having an affair with one another, and he tries to communicate with her so that she can bring him back into this world so that he can kind of like escape the realm of the Cenobites. As you can see, this is like a short little book, but the horror is pretty fast paced, and it's relentless as well. And because it's so short, I think, you know, it's low risk. You can jump into it. I think you could probably read it in an afternoon. I'm a pretty slow reader. I read it in one day, and it's very intense though. Everything on this list is intense. The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. So this is maybe my favorite book on the list. I'm just trying to think. There might be one book, actually, I think there is one book that I still haven't mentioned, which I enjoyed a bit more than this one, but still, this is a great book. The Exorcist is, you know, it's very famous, but I still, you know, I'm going to tell you about it anyway, because that's what I'm doing, right? I'm telling you about the books. But it's about a young girl named Reagan who starts showing really strange and terrifying behavior. Her mother, Chris, tries like every avenue that's available to her, every medical and psychiatric solution that she can find out there. Nothing seems to be working, and it feels like nobody can help her. And so out of pure desperation, she turns to Father Karras, who is this priest who's, you know, he's a very interesting character as well. He's kind of battling doubts with his own faith, and that makes him, you know, a bit more layered, I think. And then Karras is pulled into the exorcism, confronting pure evil as he tries to save Reagan, and he's facing questions of his faith, the fear of this situation, and the limits of human understanding. It's all kind of like mixed in. Going into this, I knew that this book was considered to be one of the scariest books that's ever been written, and I think that the expectation was met. The thing that makes this book so effective is that we get to spend time with Chris and Reagan for a good portion of this story where, you know, they're just happy and normal, and it's just a mother and her daughter. They're playing games, they're going to the movies, having fun, you know. I think because we get to see who Reagan was before she was possessed, it's that kind of like slow burn, you know, but it's so important in a book like this because when we start to see the absolutely grotesque things that lovely little Reagan does and says after seeing her as this innocent little girl, it's just extra freaky, you know? And a lot of you would have already seen the film. I also had seen the film before reading this, but even so, I think it's worth reading the book as well because I don't know, just something about the language that's used made it for me a bit creepier than the film, and I was creeped out by the film as well. Here's another little creepy book. Tender is the Flesh by Augustina Bazterrica. Um, if ever there was a book that could turn me into a vegetarian, this is the book. Tender is the Flesh is set in a very dark world where a virus has made all animal meat toxic. And so humans have turned to farming people as a food source. The main character is Marcos. He works at a meat processing plant, and this is what makes it freaky, right? He has just become numb to the horror of this new reality. You know, he's doing it day in, day out. It's just going into the office, you know. But things change when he's given a specimen as a gift. And it kind of makes him question the system that he is a part of. It kind of, you know, wakes him up to the situation and his surroundings that he's grown numb to over the years. This book is so unsettling, I think, because it reduces people down to their parts, right? Literally. And it plays with the idea that humans can normalize even the worst horrors if they can get something out of it. But it's that idea taken to its extreme, right? As a speculative work of fiction. And for me, I think the creepiest thing about the book is not that it's like really told in this shocking, in your face way, but that it's told in a kind of sterile, clinical way that talks about the farming of people with no emotion attached to it. I can't say that I enjoyed reading the book, but it definitely unsettled me. Next up is another little short book, and actually this is a collection of short stories. It's The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. So The King in Yellow is a collection of gothic short stories that all take place in this like strange, almost dreamlike version of our world. And in this world, there's this forbidden play where if you read it, it will send you insane. And some of the characters that we meet in these short stories have already read the play, and we see the effect that it's having on them. And in other short stories, we're meeting characters who own a copy of the play and they're kind of toying with the idea of reading it. You know, a lot of these characters are artists, you know, living this kind of bohemian lifestyle in, I think, mostly New York and Paris. And so yeah, they're these kind of artist types that want to have these extreme experiences, and you're always aware throughout reading these stories that there's this ambiguous evil that's lurking just below the surface that kind of exists almost parallel to the lives that these characters are living, and it's just wanting to be released and have influence over these characters. Other than some stuff that I've read by Edgar Allan Poe, I don't think I've read another book that relies so heavily on atmosphere. It's kind of difficult to explain, really, but when I was reading this book, I just think Chambers was able to create an atmosphere and distort our world just enough that it feels like the world that he's created could exist. If The King in Yellow sounds familiar, it might be because I think some of the villains in True Detective, you know, that TV show, Matthew McConaughey and is it Eddie? Is it no Woody Harrelson? And then later with Jodie Foster, I think in both of those seasons, the villains are kind of maybe influenced by the King in Yellow, by the Corcosa, which is like the world that the King in Yellow inhabits. I think there's some influence there, a little bit of crossover. Again, that's not a spoiler. I don't think it's a big part of the plot. It's just kind of like I think it's more like a what do you call it? Like a little Easter egg, you know, for fans of cosmic horror. One thing I will mention though is, and this is just my opinion about this book. I would say only read the first 4 stories if you're only looking for the horror, because beyond that, they become a little bit more romantic. You know, there's a war story in there as well, a little bit less relevant and, in my opinion, less interesting as well. But, you know, the first 4 stories are well creepy. Okay, so this next book is a little bit different to the others, I think, just because of the genre, and that is The Dark Forest by Liu Cixin. This is the second book in the Remembrance of Earth's Past series. The first book is The Three-Body Problem, which you might recognize as having just been adapted into a TV series on Netflix. Can't say too much about this story without giving spoilers for the first book, but I'll just say this. When you watch movies or read books about humanity making contact with other planets or alien species, there's usually a lot of action and spaceships fighting aircraft, like in Independence Day, for example, or there's wars going on the ground. And I think that this book offers maybe a more realistic version of what contact with an alien species might look like. There's one particular scene where my heart was racing so hard and my mouth was dry. Have you ever had it where your heart was beating so hard that your eyes start to shake a little bit? Yeah, that's what this scene was for me. And I think it's because of that scene that I had to include it in a list of top 10 scariest books that I've ever read, even though it's not a horror. Next book, which I just found so creepy, is I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid. This is a book about a young woman on a road trip with her boyfriend. I've spoken about this book, I guess, a few times on the channel. And yeah, she's with her boyfriend Jake on a road trip, heading to meet his parents at their remote farmhouse. And she is just thinking about ending their relationship. And as they get closer to the farmhouse, things start to feel just more unsettling. She's receiving strange phone calls and voice messages on her mobile, and her boyfriend's just kind of like saying unusual things as she gets a bit closer to the farmhouse. These strange events keep on happening, and soon it gets so surreal that she starts to question everything. And I, as the reader as well, was questioning everything as well. You know, you kind of get that, like, what's going on here? You know, you kind of get that feeling like, why did he say that? Why did that just happen? Why did they do that? And you start to notice these little patterns, and you're looking out for things. The best way I can explain this book really is: have you ever had a dream where you have this fear inside of you, but it's like you've arrived at the midway point of a dream, and you can't remember exactly what you're supposed to be afraid of. There's no immediate threat that you can see, but you just know that there is something wrong. That's what it feels like to read this book. And also, if you enjoy listening to audiobooks, I would recommend this book specifically as an audiobook. I think there's a couple of elements really that make it extra eerie if you listen to the book. So yeah, there you have it. Those are the 10 scariest books that I've ever read. And if you enjoyed this list and you're interested maybe in classic horror as well, then you might like the classic horror book reviews that I did in spooky season last year. You can watch those if you click up here. Thanks so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. And as always, happy reading.